To keep NATO strong, we must, however, continue to adapt. And to guarantee our security in the future, we also need to ramp up our efforts now. That also means we need to spend more on our defense. The goal of 2%, now set a decade ago, will not be enough to meet the challenges of tomorrow. The threat from Russia may seem distant, but let me assure you, it is not.
NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte today raising the bar for defense spending. He was in Lisbon, Portugal, saying that 2% target set a decade ago is now too low because of new challenges. It comes days after U.S. President Donald Trump's demand that the threshold be raised to 5% of a country's GDP to be spent on national defense. Right now, Canada is at nearly 1.4%, and the plan to hit the target of 2% is only in the year 2032. Although last week, the Minister of National Defense did say the timeline could be accelerated. It's also worth noting that NATO sees the 2% as a floor, not a ceiling. Joining me now to talk more about Rutte's comments are former Chief of the Defense Staff, General Tom Lawson. He's now the president at Thomas J. Lawson and Associates, and former commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, Vice-Admiral Mark Norman. He is a senior defense strategist at Samuel Associates. Thank you both for being here. Now, we do mention your current work. As we know, you do now work on the business side of those defense industries. But Vice Admiral, I wanted to ask you, how much pressure does this now put on Canada when you consider the ask is actually coming from the head of NATO?
Yeah, Mike, it's a continuous application of pressure over the last 18 to 24 months. Both General Lawson and I have commented previously on the fact that, this has been a long time coming. And I would add today that this public expression of a desire to increase does not come as a surprise. And the Secretary General is saying what many have been saying privately, which is that this would go up, notwithstanding the rhetoric from President Trump. And I know it's hard to separate the two, but I think we need to look at the NATO need and the legitimacy of that requirement separately from some of the language that's coming out of Washington.
Yeah, General Lawson, neither conservative nor liberal governments have been willing to increase the spending to that 2% target. Trump talking about 5% of GDP. Is that even feasible?
Frankly, no. 5% is preposterous, but you know, in the military, one of the greatest ways to get someone's attention is to have a round go off near them, and it shakes them out of their comfort zone. So I think maybe there's a little bit of negotiation tactics going on there. But I think sometimes what we lose sight of when we talk about 2%, 3%, 5% is just exactly where this money will be spent and why. What is the threat out there? Are we spending enough right now? And if we're not, and I think largely even Canadians will agree that we're not in Canada, then where should this money be going? So whether it's 2%, which is a long way from where we are right now, 3%, which I think the NATO summit will agree to in The Hague later in June, or something even north of 3% towards 5%, those are very important and large figures. But Canada right now needs to figure out whether or not we're spending enough and what are going to be the ramifications if we don't spend more.
Yeah, and Vice Admiral, I think, you know, General Lawson mentions the number, and I think it's really interesting when you dig into it because the Parliamentary Budget Officer said that hitting 2% of GDP would mean doubling our annual budget on national defense to $80 billion annually by the year 2032. So if you do some quick math, to get to 5%, that requires $200 billion. Is that just far-fetched?
Yeah, I agree completely with General Lawson. I think, you know, there's a bit of bluster going on here, and that is entirely consistent with the kind of language and rhetoric that's been coming out of Washington on a variety of issues over the last week or so. Now, notwithstanding that, it doesn't change the fact that, as General Lawson has indicated, we're not doing enough. We haven't done enough. And to be quite honest, we've put ourselves in an incredibly vulnerable position, not just with respect to the confidence of our allies, but more importantly, our actual ability to deliver the kinds of capabilities that we should have been fielding a long time ago. And this is consistent with the border security issue, although that's not a defense spending issue. It's consistent with the same problem. We've been asleep at the switch, and now we're being called out for it. And the fact that we can't even meet the current requirement is not going to necessarily put us in the right place to get to an increased expenditure. Now, that won't happen immediately. It'll require the ratification of all the members of NATO. But I agree with General Lawson that this is going to come, and there'll be a future target that we'll have to meet beyond what we're incapable of meeting today.
But General Lawson, even at that point, we know, and the two of you have been in it, Canada's defense procurement is notoriously slow. So even if we had the political will, is it possible to spend that type of money on that timeline?
Well, I think so. If we're talking to get to 2%, there's an elegant way to do that that puts a certain amount of pressure on our procurement system, but also targets other than the procurement system for a quick spend, or at least quick by historical measures. And that is, we should recognize that as all this pressure comes on Canada to spend more, there's very little pressure on how that needs to be spent. We should take advantage of that. For instance, billions right away could go into our bases, wings, and ports, which have been rusting out for many years. And the effect of that, most of that money will be spent on Canadian contractors, and that money stays in Canada. And all of a sudden, all the bases that we're training in, the home ports and wings, where our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and airwomen are living out of and training, become places that they can be proud of. And at the same time, we have to make Canada short, 10,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and airwomen, and we have to make the Canadian military an employer of choice. That means increasing pay and benefits, and right there is another couple of billion. And now we're not even talking about putting pressure on the procurement system. But to your point, Mike, yes. If it's subs that we're buying, if it's ships that we're buying, Army vehicles, more aircraft, then you've got to ask the procurement system to become more efficient. And we've had a model. They did that. When soldiers were falling in Afghanistan, we quickly got aircraft, armored personnel carriers, tanks, when the doors opened on this procurement system and it became far more efficient.
Vice-Admiral, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Trump factor, because we know that he recently had a call with the head of Denmark, and of course talking about annexing, Greenland away from Denmark. He's talked about economic coercion against Canada. From your vantage point, how should NATO allies be responding to him going after Greenland and Denmark, and this kind of rhetoric from the president?
Yeah, well, I think one of the great strengths of NATO historically is it is a very consensus-based organization. It tends to stand in solidarity, notwithstanding some of the potential arguments inside the family, so to speak. And this will endure. I have no doubt that in many of the capitals in Europe, there's a lot of head scratching going on and people wondering how they're going to deal with this kind of posturing and rhetoric. And as to the specifics, let's be honest here. These kinds of comments are as much intended to be provocative as they might be reflections of his musings at any point in time. But the annexation of Greenland, to be quite blunt, is no different than Russia's attempt to annex Crimea and Ukraine. And so if these are the kinds of games that President Trump intends to play, my instinct tells me that there'll be a lot more resistance behind the scenes than he has perhaps imagined, and those around him are telling him might be the case.
General Lawson on that?
Well, I would just add that I think a lot more room is given to President Trump in his rhetoric and his musings than would be given any other international leader. I agree with Admiral Norman that much of this is seen as bluster, but when you get right down to it, if anyone, you can imagine if our Prime Minister were to muse in any other way like this, or if NATO, if the Secretary General were to muse like this. So I think really what we see is that the same as this 2% to 5% that we're talking about right now is a negotiation. But it does bring up one last thing, and that is that this quick move in Canada, the quicker move to 2% or maybe beyond 2%, is going to have to be thought in depth if President Trump decides that these tariffs that we're talking about later in your program are going to come on. If we don't, then it's a far, far better thing to put money into defense now, not only for our defense posture, but to salve our relationship with this president than it is to muse about these tariffs coming on.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, former Chief of the Defense Staff, General Tom Lawson, and former Commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, Vice-Admiral Mark Norman. Thank you both for joining us. Really appreciate this.
Mike.